So I'm delighted to welcome Lizzie, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the new framework for learning for sustainability in initial teacher education, which aims to do just that. So Lizzie, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you everyone for joining today, either live in the session or for those of you who are watching this back. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be able to share a little bit more about the framework, and I'm grateful to Susie and Kirsten for setting up the scene in their various ways so well. I'm Lizzie Rushton. I'm Head of Education at the University of Stirling, and have had the fortune to work with the leadership group to take this piece of work forward into this current phase. So thank you to those of them who are here on the call, and also I can see some lovely familiar faces in terms of folk who have contributed to the work over the course of the last 18 months, and of course beyond. This is a step in the journey of work towards LfS, and everyone's collective effort and support and expertise is needed to keep this moving. At the outset, I also wanted, Susie mentioned it in her contribution, I just wanted to acknowledge the previous work from the Scottish Council of Deans of Education, particularly the anti-racism and initial teacher education framework that was led by Professor Khadija Mohammed and her colleagues. That framework, that approach really inspired and guided us in this piece of work. So our work really is founded on that approach and that learning. So thank you, Khadija and colleagues for giving us kind of the permission to imagine otherwise in this space. If I have my first slide, please, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So you can see there on the screen the front cover of the framework, and you can access the framework. You can download a PDF if you haven't been sent it already. I'll pop the link in the chat in a moment. But this very much is a collaborative effort from all of the 11 institutions across Scotland who provide initial teacher education. And as has been said before in the session today, initial teacher education is a critical part of the teacher education community, but it is only a part. Our feeling here is if we can get teachers at the initial stages of their careers really equipped and orientated towards this in their practice, then we're sending them out into the system with that expertise, with that orientation. But it really needs to be nurtured and supported throughout a teacher's professional life. So we very much as an ICE community recognise that we're part of a bigger community there. Also, just to underline and add to what's already been said about the distinct approach that Scotland has taken that is internationally recognised in terms of the integration of learning for sustainability across the teacher professional learning system, across the different groups and organisations that support learning for sustainability. It's distinct in terms of the different approaches in the UK, and that's something to be really valued and recognised. Of course, there's still much work to do in relation to learning for sustainability, but I think at the starting point, recognising that we have that really affirming and enabling policy context in terms of the professional standards, in terms of the expectation that this is an entitlement for all. That may not always be perfectly translated into practice, and that's in some ways to be expected, but that's our starting point in terms of advocating for this piece of work. So I think that's important to acknowledge. If I go on to my next slide, that'd be lovely. So as Susie and Kirsten have suggested, this has very much been a process of co-creation over in this phase of the work over the last, over a year and a half, nearly 2 years, gosh, in terms of this piece of work. And we've been so fortunate to draw on expertise from across the initial teacher education community. So that's those of us who are working in universities, those of us who are working in schools, the GTC Scotland, Learning for Sustainability Scotland, and other organisations. Education Scotland and Ian Menzies and his colleagues have been incredibly supportive of this work as well. And that kind of those different perspectives, those different dimensions are very much needed if we're going to be able to produce something that is of value and use. We've also drawn on the research and previous work of lots of colleagues in this space, including some who are on the call today. And again, starting from a position of initial teacher education that is research informed and has that theory practice connection, I think, is really important too. So in the process of co-creation, as you can see, it's a wiggly journey, and it hasn't ended yet. So if we're now in May 2025, and we absolutely are still on this journey together. So if you're joining us at this point, then you are very welcome. We need your energy and ideas to move us into the next phase. But we drew on an approach of a series of different types of opportunities to collaborate, which included a series of workshops, and those workshops had a gentle kind of futures orientation. So futures workshops invite us to explore ideas through three typical phases. So we have a phase of critique, so we're thinking about the problems and the frustrations that we have with the status quo in relation to, in this case, learning for sustainability and initial teacher education. And then we move through to a forward of imagining or fantasy, where we're thinking creatively together about how can we solve these problems, how can we move forward. And then in a third phase, really thinking about how do we transform those ideas into change. And so that's a kind of an ethos that we've brought to this framework, this way of working together. And I have my next slide, please. Thank you. So as has been said before, we've really been wanting to be rooted in the whole setting, approach and ethos, the 4 C's there of curriculum, cultures, communities and campus. And for those of you who are eagle-eyed or perhaps very familiar with this, we've made the decision to pluralise cultures and communities to further emphasise that different ways of knowing, being, thinking, feeling are really, really valuable in this space. There's no singular approach. And although the invitation in the action plan was to create a single national approach for learning for sustainability in initial teacher education, and that's really valuable in terms of ensuring that there is an entitlement for all student teachers, we were also very keen that each institution could develop a response through the framework that was rooted in their own place-based setting and their expertise. So how the framework is implemented in Stirling might be very different to how it's implemented in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, and so on and so on. And that's absolutely to be valued and respected. In terms of creating the framework, as it says there on the slide, we've drawn on Bob Jickling and colleagues' work of wild pedagogies. So that's really thinking about touchstones. So these are points of departure and places to return. And we've created these touchstone questions across the 4 C's as critical questions, ways to help us be reflective and to think about our practice and otherwise regularly. So it's an iterative process. Unfortunately, it's not a tick box that can be done once and put in a drawer. It's a living, breathing conversation of a document in that regard. I'm just trying to think what else I wanted to say about that. Yeah, so I think for teachers and for teacher educators and for those who are working in other settings supporting teacher education, I think we as a community would be quite familiar and used to having flexible inquiry focused questions, and that's really part of our practice as educators, as practitioners, as teachers. So we hope that these touchstone questions are very much in the spirit of that, but support and further move us forward to respond to learning for sustainability in ways that are critical, in ways that are caring, collective, and also that iterative nature. Fabulous. If I move on to the next slide, that'd be lovely. So I'm just going to touch on one of the 4 C's, and perhaps for those of you who are familiar with the work of Stirling, you might not be surprised that I've chosen to focus on curriculum. But here we, in each of the 4 C's, we give a very, very short introduction to what we understand by curriculum in the context of learning for sustainability and initial teacher education. And we have also integrated throughout the framework, as you'll see through the footnotes there, links to resources and readings and other kind of documents which support further engagement with these ideas. We've had to keep that balance between something that's useful and brief, but also something that's rooted in a wider body of work. And then you can also see on the screen there some of these examples of touchstone questions. So thinking about ways, in this case, so what opportunities are there in initial teacher education? Sorry, if we might just pop back, it's moved on just a wee bit too quickly for me. Thank you so much. What opportunities are there in initial teacher education programs for curriculum making in the context of learning for sustainability? And then breaking that down into different aspects there. And when I was working with a group of teachers yesterday with the framework, these were teachers who were not at the beginning of their practice, but they were further forward in their practice. But so the invitation that came back from them was, well, can we write some of our own questions? And I was absolutely, what a wonderful way to think about it. These are not the only questions that are available. And if they stimulate your own questions and your own ways of thinking, then we would love to hear those and love to hear about that. So, and I think that's what's really important to remember about questions, really. You know, we're seeking to encourage dialogue and reflection. We're not seeking to give a sense that there are fixed answers and knowns here. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. So that expansive open space of questions, I think, is a really valuable one, if sometimes can be a weeny bit uncomfortable. And if we move on to the next slide, that would be fabulous. So the final section, after we've moved through each of the 4 C's and presented a little bit of a summary and some example touchstone questions, we then have this section which really, as you can see there with the title, really thinks about our orientations towards action. So the framework is of value if it supports practice, if it supports movement a bit further along the journey from where you currently are, thinking about that action and that orientation across these different dimensions. And when we were working in the workshop with colleagues, those of you on the call who were there will remember there were almost an infinite number of C's: complexity, connectivity, criticality, creativity. There were lots of ways that we could have framed this, and actually that's another way to think about it. You know, what are the other areas or the other cross-cutting themes that you might want to draw out that are particularly relevant for your setting? So the touchstone questions here are really have an even more of a kind of a self-evaluation, self-reflective framework here. So what will the practice look like in a year, 3 or 5 years' time if we've moved forward with this framework? You know, how will we continue to nurture and support the community of practice that is learning for sustainability in initial teacher education? And what is the particular role of beginning teachers within that community of practice? So there's some of the questions that we're starting to think about. And if I just share a bit of a reflection from how we've been working with this at the University of Stirling. So we have a session next week, a dedicated session with the IT team to take the framework, and we're going to, if you've been to Stirling, you'll know our campus is particularly lovely. So whatever the weather, we're going outside with the framework, and we're going to be thinking about some of those touchstone questions and doing that across primary, secondary, the different areas of subject specialism, the different familiarities, to be honest, with LfS. You know, there are some colleagues in that team who will feel very, very comfortable with this kind of work, and there'll be others who are earlier on in their journey, and that's, I'm sure, only replicating the situation in school settings too. So just sharing that as a little bit of encouragement and idea about how we're starting to take this work forward into our next phase, thinking about our programme for next year, thinking about some of the changes and the adaptations and the enhancements that we can make with the framework as a guide for those conversations, as a way to orient those conversations in that regard. So I'll just finish off just by just reinforcing, I guess, that invitation that this work is ongoing, that the work will continue to be shared, and we very much value and appreciate that ongoing engagement and support. And I guess I was trying to think, you know, what would it look like in a year or two if this framework has had the impact that we would like it to? And I think for me, it's about providing a scaffold or a structure to surface some of these conversations, so that in initial teacher education settings they become perhaps more frequently visible. And that could be conversations that mentors are having in school with their student teachers. That could be part of the conversations that schools are having with their colleagues in university settings. That could be conversations that include the expertise from community groups. There are lots of ways that that can evolve, and we're really pleased to be continuing to work in this space over the next, well, I don't know when it ends, to be honest. Now the framework sector seems that the work keeps on going. So yeah, really thank you very much for the opportunity to share a little bit about the framework, and I'll pause there and look forward to engaging in discussion. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. My goodness me, it's a fantastic piece of work, and I'm just making some notes there in terms of some of the things you were saying around this being essentially a scaffold, a structure of stimulus questions, provocations, just to get people thinking about what it could look like in our setting, in our place, building and co-creating and celebrating something that is place responsive to where folk are. So before we go into our group conversations, I wonder if there are any questions or comments that folk would like to ask either Susie or Lizzie at this stage. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to rely on Susie for this. I can't see the chat or if anyone puts their hand up or anything. So, Susie, if I can rely on you, please.
No problem. We have got Julie has a question for Lizzie in the chat. I don't know if Lizzie, if you can see that question or if you want me to read it out.
No, I can see that. I was
awesome.
typing away. Yeah, thank you, Julie. And it's wonderful to have a Stirling alumni in the group there. Yes, so one of the advantages of the programme that we have at Stirling, the undergraduate programme, is the concurrent model that we have. Yeah, we do bleed green. I've only been there 2 years, and even I know this. So yes, so we have that current model for our student teachers. So they're learning with colleagues in environmental science as well as they're learning with us in education. So we have that kind of dialogue, certainly with our environmental science outdoor education staff. I haven't yet thought about sharing the framework with them to work with their students beyond simply sharing the framework, but that's a really great thought and encouragement. So yeah, that's a great question that will stimulate further connection across those different communities in our own institutions. So thank you very much for that.
I think that's a great question, is how can we be the ripple in the pond with this, that it's not just an ITE pond, this is something potentially that could add value in other places. Fantastic, thank you so much. Any other questions or comments for the wider group at this stage? No.
There's a comment there from Louise, just that loving the idea of each institution developing their own response to this framework, and I'd love each setting to develop their own response. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our institutions work with a range of settings to think about what will work, drawing on their own communities and place, and what what this framework means to them in their settings. So thank you, Louise. That's a really lovely reflection.
I think that's particularly strong in that it mirrors what's being asked of schools and early learning centres themselves. We've essentially taken that vibe and woven that across this framework as well, that it is about what matters for you, where you live, and is priority for yourselves and your learners. So it's lovely to see that ethos being threaded across the piece.